We make a great mistake in supposing all people are capable of self-government. John Calhoun, every civilization fears pain, wars, plagues, tyrannies. These are the enemies we often study in history books. But what if what truly destroys societies isn't suffering, but the opposite? What if the most lethal threat comes disguised as something seemingly harmless? Pleasure, comfort, entertainment. Aldous Huxley, long before us, perceived a frightening inversion. Perhaps humanity was not enslaved by iron chains, but by invisible chains made of pleasurable stimuli. We wouldn't need violent dictators if we had infinite distractions. We wouldn't need prison camps if we had amusement parks. And we wouldn't need censorship if people simply chose not to think, as long as they had enough pleasures to numb them. And the most disturbing thing is that Huxley wasn't talking about distant fiction. Look around. We've never had so much comfort, so much access to immediate stimulation, such an abundance of small pleasures at our fingertips. Social networks that offer rewards every second, endless catalogues of movies and series, chemical and digital drugs to soothe any discomfort. We live in a time where pain has been outsourced, silence has been murdered, and effort has become optional. But what is the cost of a world that eliminates all hardship? History shows us that excessive pleasure does not breed happiness, but decay. When there is nothing left to achieve, the spirit weakens. When every void is immediately filled, the soul forgets how to wait, how to fight, how to endure. And it is at this point that pleasure ceases to be a choice and becomes a prison. Not a prison that oppresses, but a prison that lulls. A prison so comfortable that no one wants to escape. This is the pleasure trap, a seductive trap that seems harmless, but slowly erodes the human capacity for purpose. Because immediate pleasure satisfies, but doesn't fulfill. It distracts, but doesn't give meaning. It teaches us to chase the next pleasurable sensation, until, without realizing it, we become dependent on it, willing slaves to artificial stimuli. What's at stake here isn't just a philosophical debate about hedonism, it's a warning about the very survival of our consciousness. Because when a society surrenders to limitless pleasure, it loses something essential, the ability to endure discomfort in the name of something greater. And a culture that can no longer endure discomfort can also not sustain freedom. What Huxley showed us is that the enemy of the future may not be suffering, but constant anesthesia. Dictatorship no longer needs pain when pleasure already serves the role of extinguishing the flame of human will. The question is, are we already living in that future? Pleasure as a tool of submission. Power never acts in a vacuum. It needs instruments. In the past, these instruments were clear. Armies, prisons, punishments. Governing meant imposing obedience through pain. But what happens when rulers discover that pleasure can do the same job, and with much less resistance? Aldous Huxley understood this mechanism with almost prophetic clarity. For him, the key was not to brutally suppress human desires, but to expand them to saturation. Because a suffering person is dangerous. They can rebel. They can seek change. They can risk everything to escape their condition. But a man entertained, fed by constant small pleasures, sees no reason to move. They believe themselves free, when in fact they are chained to their own rewards. Pleasure works like a collective anesthetic. It doesn't eliminate life's contradictions, but it makes them seem bearable. The exhausted worker no longer organizes to protest. He prefers to lose himself in hours of cheap entertainment after work. The young, instead of enduring the discipline necessary to create something meaningful, find immediate gratification in digital stimuli that steal their creative energy. And so, little by little, pleasure becomes a political mechanism, not a right earned, but a bargaining chip that guarantees obedience. Modern systems no longer need to suppress information like the totalitarian regimes of the past. Just make sure that information arrives diluted in a sea of distractions. Serious news mixed with celebrity gossip. Complex ideas crushed by easy slogans. Pleasure doesn't censor, but stifles. It doesn't prohibit, but diverts. It acts like an invisible veil that covers the eyes, until the truth no longer arouses interest. Modern psychology explains well why this works. The human brain is programmed to seek quick rewards. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of desire, is triggered whenever we receive something pleasant, a sweet treat, a compliment, a notification on our phone. It's as if each small pleasure is a secret obedience button. And those who control these buttons know this. Digital platforms, consumer industries, populist governments, they all understand that offering constant stimulation creates dependence, and dependence is submission. Huxley said that people would come to love their servitude. This is perhaps his most disturbing observation, because pleasure doesn't need armed guards to maintain order. It turns each citizen into their own jailer. When life boils down to the next dose of satisfaction, no one wants to risk losing the comfort they already have. The fear of discomfort replaces the courage of freedom. But here's the cruelest detail. Pleasure, when used as a tool of submission, doesn't truly satisfy. It creates endless cycles of need. The person is never complete. They always need one more purchase, one more like, one more stimulus. The promise is happiness, but the result is empty. And in this emptiness, the system finds the perfect space to perpetuate itself. Because those who are always chasing small rewards have neither the time nor the energy to pursue greater purposes. Thus, pleasure becomes an elegant disguise for servitude. It makes submission seem like a choice. The individual believes they are simply enjoying life, when in fact they are being molded, guided, and domesticated, and power silently thanks them. The Universe. 25 Experiment. Rat's Utopia. In the 1970s, an ethologist named John Calhoun performed an experiment that became known as Universe 25. The goal seemed simple: to create a paradise for rats. They would lack nothing. Plenty of food, fresh water, controlled temperatures, clean shelters, and a complete absence of predators. A perfect world, free of threats and hardships. The idea was to observe what would happen when all the conditions for survival were permanently guaranteed. At first, everything worked as expected. The rats explored the space, formed groups, and reproduced rapidly. It was as if the promised utopia had finally taken shape. During the early stages, the population grew steadily and in an organized manner. There was cooperation, shared space, and balance. But this harmony would not last long. As the population grew, a strange phenomenon began to emerge. Excessive proximity generated stress. Stronger males became aggressive, while weaker ones isolated themselves, avoiding any interaction. Females, who had previously cared for their young, began to reject or even eliminate them. Previously instinctive behaviors, linked to the preservation of the species, disappeared within a few breeding cycles. The collapse, however, reached its most symbolic form when a peculiar group of rats appeared, christened by Calhoun as the Beautiful Ones. These animals didn't fight, didn't mate, didn't participate in social life. They limited themselves to eating, sleeping, and compulsively grooming themselves, keeping their coats impeccable. Beautiful on the outside, empty on the inside. There was no struggle, no purpose, no function. Just mechanical repetition of basic pleasures, until the colony fell into stagnation and finally, death. What this experiment revealed was disturbing. When all discomfort disappears, the very life force of the species dissolves. By eliminating the challenges of survival, Calhoun also eliminated the meaning of existence for those rats. They no longer needed to conquer anything. There were no obstacles to overcome, no dangers to face, no scarcity to circumvent. And so, without a struggle, they also lost their reason for living. It's impossible not to draw parallels with our society. We live in an environment where much of the hardship has been tamed by technology and modern comfort. We no longer need to hunt for food, walk miles to fetch water, or face predators to survive. Everything is within reach of a click, a button, a screen. And yet, or perhaps precisely because of this, we have never been so fragile, anxious, and apathetic. Like the rats of the Universe 25, we find ourselves surrounded by stimuli that promise immediate pleasure but offer no purpose. We seek likes instead of real recognition, comfort instead of challenge, distraction instead of meaning. We create our own version of beautiful ones. People who live only to maintain appearances, obsessed with their bodies and aesthetics, but disconnected from any inner mission. Beautiful on the outside, empty on the inside. Calhoun's experiment was a microcosm of what Huxley had already predicted. Abundant pleasure doesn't strengthen, it weakens. It doesn't unite, it fragments. It silently corrodes, transforming vitality into passivity until civilization, even surrounded by everything it desires, implodes from within. The question that remains is inevitable. Are we already living within our own universe, 25 human? The entertainment society, the new dictatorship. The great dictatorships of the past always relied on censorship, explicit violence, and open persecution. Power was maintained through fear, the fear of imprisonment, torture, exile, and death. But what Huxley anticipated, and what we see before our eyes today, is a new, far more sophisticated form of domination. A dictatorship that doesn't need to silence voices, because they themselves are silenced by the incessant noise of entertainment. We've never had so much access to content, images, music, series, and stimuli. We've never been so free to choose what to watch, listen to, or share. But this freedom is illusory because the choice has already been made for us. The algorithm delivers exactly what we want in the precise dose to keep our attention. There's no whip, no order, just the seduction of an endless flow that seems harmless, but captures us as effectively as any iron regime. Entertainment functions as a constant distraction. It prevents the mind from resting in silence, because silence is dangerous. It is where questions, discomfort, and doubts arise. When the mind is constantly occupied, whether with short videos, games, soap operas, or sports, there's no room for deep reflection. Politics can collapse. The economy can crumble. Values can be lost. As long as entertainment is available, the crowd will remain calm. This is where Huxley's prediction proves even more acute. Orwell feared a world where books would be banned. Huxley feared a world where no one would be interested in reading them anymore. Orwell imagined that truth would be suppressed. Huxley, that it would be drowned in irrelevances. Orwell feared pain. Huxley feared pleasure. And it is precisely this inversion that characterizes contemporary dictatorship. We no longer need a visible enemy, because we have already been seduced by invisible distraction. Entertainment, in this sense, is political. It doesn't just occupy time, it shapes the way we think, and even more so, the way we stop thinking. Complex ideas give way to catchphrases. Debates are replaced by memes. Patience for deep analysis is exchanged for momentary indignation that disappears with the next scroll. Power no longer needs to convince. It just needs to keep everyone entertained, numb, and smiling. But this anesthesia comes at a cost. The more we immerse ourselves in distractions, the more we become unable to bear any discomfort. The slightest pause, the slightest wait, the slightest setback already seems unbearable. We've created an entire generation incapable of dealing with silence, dependent on external stimuli to feel that life has any flavor. And so, we lose the most essential capacity of freedom, the ability to bear the weight of reality without needing to escape it. This is the new dictatorship. Gentle, colorful, pleasant. It doesn't impose pain, it offers pleasure. It doesn't oppress, it entertains. It doesn't silence us, but it speaks so loudly, in so many voices, that we can no longer hear what truly matters. And deep down, this form of domination is perhaps even more dangerous than any explicit tyranny, because it's not imposed against our will, it's chosen. And like any chosen prison, it is almost impossible to break. The price of pleasure, the existential void. Pleasure is sweet, but it comes at a high price. The promise is always the same: immediate satisfaction, quick relief, instant happiness. But the more we chase that promise, the more distant it seems. What should be a feast becomes an endless race, where each pleasure lasts only briefly and soon gives way to another desire. It's like drinking seawater. The more you consume, the thirstier you feel. Nietzsche described this process in his image of the last man, the human being who no longer seeks greatness, but only comfort. This last man suffers no great pain, but neither does he know great joy. He lives protected, surrounded by comforts, seeking only security and small rewards. He is someone who smiles constantly, but whose smile hides apathy. Life is reduced to a sequence of shallow distractions. And here lies the cruelest point. When everything is pleasure, nothing else has value. The absence of pain leaves the spirit atrophied. The absence of effort saps the meaning of achievement. The individual becomes accustomed to a world in which every discomfort can be avoided, and in the process, loses touch with their own ability to create meaning. Constant pleasure kills the scarcity that gives life its flavor. This logic also appears in societies. Civilizations that achieved material abundance tend to plunge into cycles of moral and cultural decay. The Roman Empire, at the height of its wealth, preferred bread and circuses to public debate. The population, satisfied with spectacles and comfort, allowed the political and military structure to deteriorate. The same pattern repeated itself in later empires, and there is no indication that our era is an exception. Psychology explains this phenomenon in simple terms. Pleasure doesn't accumulate, it depletes. The human brain adapts quickly to stimuli. What was sufficient yesterday seems insufficient today. Tolerance emerges, then dependence, and finally, emptiness. When life is organized around the pursuit of successive pleasures, one becomes trapped in a cycle of need and frustration. This existential void manifests itself in clear symptoms: anxiety, depression, apathy, loss of purpose. The more distractions available, the harder it becomes to face inner silence. One becomes accustomed to running away from any discomfort, and, by running away, one loses the chance to learn from it. Pain and hardship have always been humanity's teachers. They shape character, courage, and resilience. Without these teachers, all that remains is a prolonged childhood, an immaturity masquerading as freedom. The price of pleasure, then, is not just psychological, it's spiritual. It slowly erodes the fundamental question: what for? What are we left with when every void can be filled by a screen, a purchase, a momentary sensation? What remains of humanity in us if we no longer know how to wait, fight, or sacrifice? Huxley realized that infinite pleasure does not generate infinite happiness. It generates a slow death of the soul, a death that comes not from without, but from within. And that's what makes this enemy so dangerous. There are no screams, no chains, no blood. Only superficial smiles, tired eyes, and a profound silence that betrays the absence of meaning. This is the price of pleasure. And when it is accepted as the supreme value, the price we receive is the loss of what made us truly human. Conclusion: freedom requires pain. Ultimately, Huxley's message was not just a warning about the future, but a mirror held up to us. The real risk lies not in living under visible tyrants, but in becoming willing accomplices to an invisible tyranny. A tyranny made of constant pleasures, endless stimuli, distractions that promise happiness, but silently lead us away from any real purpose. And here, an uncomfortable truth is revealed. Freedom demands pain. Not the cruel pain of oppression or violence, but the necessary pain of effort, of discipline, of facing reality without anesthesia. The pain of facing inner silence, of dealing with boredom, of carrying responsibilities. This pain is the price of authenticity, because only it lifts us from comfortable inertia and forces us to grow. When everything becomes too easy, human beings become fragile. Unlimited pleasure doesn't strengthen, it softens. It doesn't expand consciousness, it numbs it. It doesn't make us more human, but less so. And that's precisely why enduring pain, in the philosophical, psychological, and even spiritual sense, is the only way to regain freedom. A society that rejects any discomfort has already signed its cultural death warrant. An individual who flees from all suffering has already renounced their own greatness. Nietzsche said that one must have chaos within oneself to generate a dancing star. In other words, it is in friction, in tension, in confrontation with what hurts, that the most elevated works and the freest spirits are born. Without pain, there is no creation. Without effort, there is no transformation. Without confrontation, there is no liberation. The lesson of Universe 25 reinforces this point brutally. By eliminating difficulties, we also eliminate the reason for existing. A life made only of pleasures is, in fact, a life without direction. Likewise, a society that seeks only comfort ends up becoming too fragile to face any real crisis. Abundance without sacrifice inevitably leads to emptiness. The path to freedom, therefore, lies not in rejecting pleasure completely, but in putting it back in its rightful place. Pleasure is a complement, not a guide, a respite, not a destination. What sustains a meaningful life is the ability to endure discomfort in the name of something greater, a value, a cause, a truth. It is in this space between pain and purpose that true autonomy is born. Huxley showed us that the greatest danger is not losing the right to speak, but losing the will to think. It's not being prevented from seeking truth, but ceasing to want to seek it, because entertainment is more comfortable. The future of freedom, then, depends on our willingness to endure what pleasure constantly tries to spare us. Pain is not the enemy of life. It's what reminds us we're alive. It's what keeps us moving. It's what forces us to question, to resist, to change. Therefore, a free society is not one that eliminates all suffering, but one that has the courage to face it head-on, without illusions. In the end, the choice is simple, but requires courage. Live numb in a gilded prison, or endure the pain that paves the way to true freedom.